it start?
Oh, never mind. Just kidding.
Oh, it's already recording.
Okay.
Okay. We are going to share our second language acquisition project with you. Our metaphor was second language acquisition is like baking a cake. So we started with a recipe book, an SLA cookbook, and we are going to make an SLA layer cake. So this recipe book represents second language acquisition. A single recipe within this book can be used to explain the stages.
And first is the comprehension stage of SLA. During this time, second language learners go through a silent period in which they listen and absorb the language around them. When reading a recipe in a book, it is typical to view the recipe and consider the ingredients, the process of making the recipe, and understanding the directions. This, too, is a silent period in which you take in information and essentially wrap your brain around it. The monitor hypothesis, which states that learned knowledge acts as a filter and interferes with the natural process of language, could be used to explain how we think a recipe differs from another recipe we have used in the past.
So next, when we begin to gather the ingredients to make the recipe, a person may read or say a single ingredient out loud before moving to gather it from the kitchen. This represents early production stage, where a second language learner can produce 1 or 2 words at a time. It's unrealistic to gather all of the ingredients, which are over here, at once. They would typically get 1 ingredient at a time as they prepare to make the recipe, because typically they don't know the language well enough yet to gather them all at once or to speak all the words at once.
Then after the ingredients are gathered 1 to 2 at a time, it is time to begin reading the directions. This represents the speech emergence stage of language acquisition. During this time, we read or produce phrases and short sentences to take the ingredients and incorporate them in the right order to effectively begin the mixing process. So we don't start using the language all at once. We just use we use short phrases at a time, or 1 to 2 words at a time. The natural order hypothesis, which states that we acquire language in a predictable order, could be used to explain how we put the ingredients in the bowl in a certain order to produce a delicious cake.
And lastly is the intermediate fluency stage of language acquisition. During this stage, the directions of the recipe, which are over here, have been followed and the ingredients have been combined. I could easily at this stage share the recipe or the process with another person that inquired how I made the delicious cake. I could share the ingredients of what I used, how I combined them, the process of making the cake. The input hypothesis, which states that the use of comprehensible input, language just slightly higher than the learner has acquired, could be used to explain how we could continue to increase our fluency in language by trying more difficult, higher level recipes to build on fluency.
There are other important factors. Second language acquisition is different from first language acquisition in that learners are usually older and more cognitively developed. This is represented in the critical period hypothesis. It could be said that older and more cognitively developed a learner is, their ability to read the recipe and make the cake would be greater or easier.
Other factors in learning language are language aptitude and motivation. If you have a higher aptitude for cooking or baking, or you're more likely to succeed in making a cake. If you're more motivated, if you're highly motivated to make the cake, maybe you get to eat a slice at the end, then you are more motivated to learn how to make the cake, or in this case, learn a second language.
The affective filter hypothesis can be used to represent that if a learner or a baker is worried about baking, has anxiety about the process, or lacks motivation to learn a language or bake a cake, their acquisition will be reduced. So if they're really anxious or they're really stressed out, they're not going to be as apt to learn the language because they're more worried about their feelings. This could also be explained as if the temperature of the oven is not appropriate for baking, then the cake will be underbaked or overbaked.
Okay. Let me see. Are we ready for the ingredients?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're going to kind of talk about, we're going to move away from the recipe book and we're going to talk about the ingredients of our cake. Going to sleep. So I'll just kind of move those over here where we can still kind of see them. Maybe. And then we'll talk about them. Oh, there's milk back here. Thank you.
Oh, right. Sorry. So we have a lot of ingredients here to make a cake. These ingredients are very important in acquiring a second language, just like they would be in a cake. You need all of these things in order to make the cake rise and to make the cake turn out the way you want it to. When they are combined, they produce language proficiency, just like baking a cake. It is important that all of the ingredients are used according to the recipe and the directions are followed. Leaving out ingredients or not following the directions of the recipe could produce a cake that would be lacking, just like omitting major parts of language learning process.
So these ingredients are very important. We're going to start with types of language input. There are many different types of input that go into acquiring a language, just like there's a lot of different ingredients that go into making a cake. Depending on the type of cake you're wanting to bake will determine the ingredients that are best for your cake. So if we were going to make a chocolate cake or a strawberry cake or a vanilla cake, or we were going to make any kind of different flavored cake, that would require us to have different types of input or different ingredients. Output is the production of language. So speaking a language that's being learned is an important part of the process. Output is representative of the finished cake, which is back here that we're going to talk a little bit more about later. All the ingredients of input were mixed together and they helped form output.
Feedback is also important. It occurs when learners attempt to adjust their output when it reaches an acceptable level of understanding. This could be described as eating the cake or sharing it with a small group of friends. After trying the cake, it is discussed what is good about it, what is not quite right. So someone's going to tell you, hey, I think that had too much salt, or hey, I think maybe you need to try this, just like you would with a learner. Lastly, error analysis of the output comes after the feedback stage. This is when the learner will attempt to figure out what error in the language was made and determine a course of action or how to fix the error. This is when the baker considers the tasting and discussion of the cake and tries to figure out how. These ingredients all work together. They are like the sugar, butter, milk, and eggs. They must be mixed in a particular order to ensure the wet ingredients mix evenly.
So we have some other ingredients here. Interlanguage can be an ingredient of our cake, and that occurs when language characteristics from a first language are transferred to a second language.
Translanguaging is when EL's first language is used to communicate and understand difficult content in conjunction with second language, or L2s.
Here we have attention and noticing. We give attention to written text and speech, which is input, and it's only when we give notice, when we notice language forms that we learn a language. This can be represented as the salt in a cake. It gives the cake slight flavor. You might not notice it when you're tasting the cake, but if you added too much attention, it would be very noticeable.
And self-efficacy and motivation, which is represented here, are like the baking soda and baking powder of the cake. They help the cake rise, just like self-efficacy and motivation help a student rise to the challenge of learning a new language.
Okay, so we're going to kind of move these off to the side really quick. I'll just slide them out of the way. Okay, so when you're baking a cake, you of course need the recipe. You need the ingredients that we have over here, but you're going to need something, you're going to need utensils. So the utensils, they are going to represent the strategies of second language learning and acquisition. So the first one, let me see where it is. Oh, here it is scaffolding. And we have that, I don't know if you can see this, it's represented by a cooling rack. So scaffolding can be represented as the cooling racks used to cool the cakes when they come out of the oven. Initially, you'll need to use them to cool your cakes, but as the cakes begin to cool down, you can remove the racks. And just like scaffolding, you use tools to scaffold when your students need them and gradually remove them as they become more proficient.
Not only do you need scaffolding in this cooling rack, but you also need these utensils that we have here. We have whisk and spoons and things like that, and these are similar to strategies. Strategies are like utensils that help mix the ingredients together. They assist in combining the necessary ingredients together to make sure the cake bakes evenly and all of the ingredients are a cohesive batter and work together just like we would in language.
So like this one has explicit vocabulary instruction on it. This one talks about scaffolding instruction so that students can be successful. This talks about using cognates to help Spanish speakers learn English and derive meaning, and error correction. So obviously there's a plethora of strategies, but we just represented 4 using the utensils. You need a bowl to mix up a cake. This is supposed to represent group dynamics and interaction. Group dynamics and the interaction that occurs in the group are like a bowl. It is here that all the ingredients come together to interact, and second language acquisition becomes one cohesive batter or group. So we're taking the recipe, we're taking the ingredients, we're using these strategies, and we're putting them all in here together to interact with each other to create a batter for our cake.
And once you have used your recipe book and you've gathered your ingredients and you've used your strategies and your utensils and your scaffolds, you can begin to bake and make your cake. So these language approaches represent the layers of the cake. We have several layers in our cake. According to the different theorists, language can be acquired a variety of ways. Sometimes these hypotheses are mixed and matched to form an understanding of how language is acquired. This could be represented by having different flavors in each layer, perhaps a marbling of 2 flavors to form one layer. Or maybe we use vanilla and we use chocolate, we use strawberry, we can use different flavors. So there are 3 different types of theorists. The behavioralism, which is knowing a second language, is learning a new set of verbal behaviors. This is accomplished through drills, exercises, memorization, and error corrections. And Skinner was the behavioralist we think of when we do this. Another one is the innatism theory. This is when language is a function of the mind. We as humans are wired for it, and it is an innate ability to acquire language. This is accomplished through immersion, reading, listening, and speaking. And when we think of this theory, we think of Chomsky and we think of Krashen. They were the 2 that kind of were the father of this theory. And then constructivism is the last theory that we think of when we think of second language acquisition. This is language development is a social process and is dependent on interaction with others. This is accomplished by cooperative learning, scaffolding, interactions with others, and when we think of this theory, we think of Vygotsky.
Okay, so within each layer of the cake, you'll find different flavors, tastes, textures, representing the different hypotheses of each language approach. So she talked about the behaviorism layer. We thought that could be easily represented by a vanilla cake because it's the most basic flavor. It talks about Skinner, and he suggests that language was a behavior that was learned through memorization of vocabulary and positive reinforcement. We thought that the innatism layer could be represented by strawberry because it's the flavor that occurs naturally, and Chomsky and Krashen thought that we were all born with this innate ability to acquire language, so we thought a natural flavor would be good for that layer. And then this last layer, our constructivism layer, which is represented as chocolate, the most complex and flavorful layer, could be represented by Vygotsky and Kagan's theories that suggest language is acquired through social interaction and cooperative learning. These also take into the account of sociocultural aspects, which can be quite complex depending on the culture. So the last part of the cake would be the decorating of the cake. So we thought that this could be represented by adding decorations to the cake would be like as our second language acquisition got better and our grammar improved, not only is our cake going to look better, but as we speak, our language is going to sound better. It's going to sound more native, and people are going to more easily understand us. And as our grammar improves, it's like decorating a cake. Our language sounds better as our grammar and our form development improves. Okay, so that is our SLA model presentation. Second language acquisition is like baking a cake.
See ya.
Bye.